Welcome back to the channel. This is another FPL video and podcast, and this time I'll be rating over 20 of your fantasy Premier League teams ahead of the Game Week 1 deadline. And next up will be my own team selection, so keep your eyes peeled by smashing the like button and subscribing to my channel. All your support is massively appreciated. Our aim is to get this video to the 200 likes, and let's keep on pushing towards 35 subscribers. If you want to see an updated lineups video and podcast, then be sure to let me know down in the comment section below, as there could be a few changes to certain lineups I discussed, but I did talk about some variables in that podcast already. And of course, the deadline stream on Friday is yet another piece of content headed your way, and UCL Fantasy will be returning very soon to FPL Dylan as well. Now, Jacob Murphy is on screen. He's another differential I didn't really discuss throughout the summer, but he did very well last season in limited minutes, only 14 starts, 3 goals, 8 assists, 82 FPL points, and his ownership is only 1%. The opening 4 game weeks look great, and he's been on fire in pre-season. So Jacob Murphy is definitely worth considering, and I think Anthony Gordon and Jacob Murphy will be the starting wingers for Newcastle. The first team is sent in by Chaze, who says, considering dropping a midfielder to bolster the defensive line. Now, what immediately stands out to me is that your attack is quite strong with Haaland, Isak and Chris Wood, who I like a lot for the first 3 game weeks of the season. Beyond that, you could switch him to Manice, Joao Pedro or another budget forward. You could even downgrade to a 4.5 million option like Jebison and then use those funds to upgrade your defensive line, as you just mentioned. Your team structure is quite versatile. You can play multiple formations and switch between multiple assets in the midfield and forward line. Good squad depth is also a big plus point, and your captaincy choices are sound with Salah and Erling Haaland. You could even consider Isak, of course, which I'm sure you've done so already. While Alisson is expensive, he offers the best chance of clean sheets for the first 8 game weeks of any goalkeeper in the game. Now, a few things I would suggest, or room for improvement in your 50-man squad, is that Turner has very high ownership for a 4 million goalkeeper, so he's quite prone to having his price go down as more managers sell him when they realise that he's not going to be the starting goalkeeper for Nottingham Forest, because it will be sales just as we saw towards the end of last season. So that's something you could improve on. It's a very minor nitpick, and a double up in the Nottingham Forest attack could be a problem beyond game week 3 with Morgan Gibbs-White and Chris Wood. But for the first 3 game weeks, it looks quite good on paper, but I would consider maybe diversifying your attack a little bit, because you've also got a double up in the Newcastle attack as well. That's kind of a personal preference for me, but your squad depth should nullify this issue quite substantially. And my final point is they have 2 4 million defenders, which isn't ideal. I like Barco for the short to medium term, so long as Estupinian is out. I think the Argentine can do very well in his absence, but I would recommend upgrading Wild fast, and you can do that by downgrading Gibbs-White, for example, to Emil Smith-Rowe, who is arguably a better asset in the long term regardless. But apart from that, I have to say it's a very solid squad, a great way to kick things off with this video and podcast. And let's now move on to the second team. CoopDog made this team after the Solanke transfer to Tottenham Hotspur. He believes he'll take penalties from Heung-min Son, and I think I'm on the same boat in that regard. He also went for Nico Williams because he's the most attacking defender in Nuno's setup against the Bournemouth side, adapting to losing their main man, and he will rotate nicely with Dunk. The rest is pretty template except for Brereton Diaz, who I expect to be a key player for Southampton, quoting CoopDog of course, only 0.5% selected. Paulson is the 4 million goalkeeper, as his price will lock after FPL registers his transfer, which is also a valid point. Greaves is the 4 million defender because Barco would lose his spot to Kadioglu if signed, or rotated with Baleba if not, and Ipswich have a favourable fixture run from game weeks 3 to 10. Now, I have to say, I'm not sure if Kadioglu will go to Brighton Hove Albion, and I expect Barco to be the main left back whilst Estupinian is out. I would highly doubt that Brighton will sign someone in that position, so that's maybe an area where I disagree with you on. But overall, very solid front line with plenty of variety. Isak is a great captaincy choice with his terrific home record, and he was a flat track bully last season. Your squad depth is decent, and you've also got Brereton Diaz, who is a promising differential that I discussed very briefly towards the end of one of my recent videos and podcasts. And also 2 of the best defenders in Trent and Borro are in your team. But I have to be honest, for game week 1, I would consider starting Rodgers over Brereton Diaz, but that's kind of a personal preference there. And your other defenders aren't very appealing. I'd recommend Anderson, Quansah, Hall or Burn, Konsa, Mikalenko and Barco. I think they're better choices than Nico Williams, despite your valid points about him, Lewis Dunk and Greaves. Barco will start until Estupiñán returns, of course, and that could be in Game Week 4 or 5. Nkunku and Brereton Diaz have poor fixtures on paper in Game Week 1, which is a slight issue, of course, not a big problem, but still worth mentioning. And Spurs are unreliable defensively, and Bordeaux faces Newcastle and Arsenal in Game Weeks 3 and 4. So as you can tell, I don't have many problems with this team, just like with the first squad I analysed. But I think overall you've got a very solid foundation. I just consider making a few modifications to your starting 11, like Morgan Rogers over Brereton Diaz, and possibly upgrading one of your defenders at the very least. The third team was sent in through Instagram by Guy37, and I have to say Pickford has great fixtures until Game Week 14, so he's a very good choice in the goalkeeper position. You have a solid defence for the opening game week. The midfield and forward line are full of good options, and Saka is a nice differential for the captaincy, although I personally prefer Isak and Salah for Game Week 1. Now, in terms of areas you can improve, I think Barco is a short-term pick with a lot of potential, but I'd try to upgrade Harwood Bellis to a 4.5 million defender for more squad depth. Now, if you'd rather keep him and sell Barco, I can understand that, but my preference is with the Argentine there, and I'd recommend moving Fraser to Jebinson, who could get plenty of game time for Bournemouth. He might even start in Game Week 1. He scored in a recent friendly against Girona and got plenty of game time throughout pre-season. And 2 attacking double-ups in Newcastle and Aston Villa isn't necessarily a bad thing, but you may want to diversify the attack slightly, especially if you want to kind of navigate the fixture swings in a better way, because after Game Week 4, Newcastle have some tough fixtures. Fulham away in Game Week 5 isn't so bad, but then they've got a very tough one in Game Week 6 against Manchester City, which is worth considering. And with Aston Villa, for example, they play Arsenal in Game Week 2, and you might want to navigate things a little bit better by diversifying one of those attacks at least, but that's a very minor nitpick in the grand scheme of things. It's another solid draft. I like your captaincy pick. Even Watkins as a vice is a nice shout, and your bench order is pretty much spot on in your 50-man squad. Number 4 is by HolySmashGod, who sent it through Twitter or X, and what immediately stands out to me is that Trent and Munoz are excellent picks in the defensive line. You cover multiple teams offensively with only one attacking double up in Newcastle. Son is an explosive pick for the first few game weeks, but I'm not a big fan of him in Game Week 3 or 4. You may want to switch that in Game Week 3, for example, but you have 2 of the best forwards in the game in Watkins and Isak, which is very competitive considering you have no Erling Haaland, but you've got the next best strikers in the game. And Nkunku has fantastic fixtures from Game Weeks 2 to 8 to compensate for the opening game against Man City. Now, my biggest issues with this squad would be the fact that Flecken is a good 4.5 million goalkeeper, but he faces Liverpool and Man City in the opening 4 game weeks, and your 4.5 million forward is of course injured now. You did send this team before the red flag, so you may want to sell him to Jebison, for example, or upgrade him to a 5.5 million forward like Joao Pedro. And Gvardiol is still a good pick, but Man City are missing key players like Rodri, and they haven't kept a single clean sheet throughout pre-season, so you may want to change that to an Arsenal defender or downgrade to Pedro Porro or even a cheaper defender to then upgrade other positions like your 4.5 million forward. But overall, it's a very solid squad. As you can tell from most of this video and podcast, I'll be giving very minor nitpicks and areas of improvement. There's no such thing as a perfect squad, and you'll see that in my team selection video and podcast. Here we have Kevvy's squad, and he says rotating the midfield draft, mainly Kudus to Smith Rowe or vice versa. Also, Anderson could change to a 4.5 million Newcastle defender, and most likely going to switch to Leif Davis after Game Week 2. Looking to downgrade White to Calafiori if he starts looking nailed too. So some very good points, interesting ones being made there in the message. But I have to say, a nice balance to your attack is already a big factor of your squad with multiple teams covered. That's something that I like personally, but of course, double ups can work even if you have 2 or 3 of them in your squad. Kudus is an overlooked differential who can perform very well despite West Ham's tough opening fixtures. Onana generally makes a lot of saves, so he's a good FPL option, and I have to say he could be a decent choice in goal, but don't put the vice captaincy on him. I know you may have overlooked this when sending the image and you probably changed it afterwards, but always make sure you order your bench and change the vice to a very solid dependable option. And in your case, you've got Saka or Erling Haaland, who are very viable vice captaincy options there, with Isak being a great captaincy shout, by the way. And I have to say your front 3 is excellent. You've got the captaincy choice spot on in my opinion, but in terms of improving it, apart from the point I just made about ordering your bench and vice captaining a different player, I'd probably say Barco would be second on the bench, that's fair, but I'd swap Smith Rowe and Wout Fass. You could even start Emil Smith Rowe in Game Week 1, and I have to say downgrading Gvardiol to Porro or a 4.5 million defender could help you to upgrade a Wout Fast, for example, so you don't have 2 4 million defenders. It's not the end of the world, of course. A lot of people have sent in teams with 2 4 million defenders. It's just I'd rather go for another 4.5 million option if you can, because we are sport for choice at that price point in the defensive line. But you already have good squad depth. It's not a completely mandatory thing. It's not like it's a make or break for your season, but I think that would improve your squad even further and you'll do very well in Game Week 1. A long-time viewer of my channel is Lage, who says the following: I am leaning towards this at the moment. I might change Burn to Mykolenko. I could downgrade Robertson and try to get in a better forward for Cannon or a better midfielder for Rodgers, which are all very good suggestions and ways of improving your team, but what you have already is very strong. I think it's a balanced squad in terms of funds allocated to each position. Salah is arguably the best Game Week 1 captain, so putting him as the captain is absolutely spot on for me. Isak as the vice is probably what I'd go for if I had both in my 15-man squad. Your defensive squad depth is also strong, and the points potential for the first 4 game weeks is extremely high. Now, the main issues I have with the squad is that Harwood Bellis isn't my favourite 4 million defender. If you wanted to go for another one, I'd recommend Barco, even if it's a very short-term pick. And there's a chance that Robertson doesn't start, as his only minutes in pre-season came against Las Palmas in a 0-0 draw, and that was pretty much part of the B team because Liverpool played 2 friendlies on the same day and they played a lot of first teamers in that 4-1 win over Sevilla, and Tsimikas started as he has done throughout most of this summer. So Robertson is a very risky pick. You could move him on to Saliba, Pedro Porro, or a 4.5 million defender, and that gives you enough funds to make other incremental improvements to your squad, which isn't necessary, but it could also go a long way to building a very strong squad beyond the first 4 game weeks. I also think Cannon to Jebinson or a 5.5 million forward could be a significant upgrade, and the Newcastle triple up and the Aston Villa attacking double up is promising, but may require transfers very soon, particularly when Newcastle's fixtures turn for the worse in Game Week 5 or 6, depending on how you view Fulham away as a fixture for Newcastle. But overall, another strong squad with a high scoring potential in Game Week 1, and even in Game Weeks 2, 3 and 4, I could see Lage doing very well in FPL. Next in line is Nick Navas, who sent in several drafts, and this is his latest one, which is very balanced in terms of coverage and money spent in each position. Alexander-Arnold is the top defender for the first 8 game weeks of the season, and Jefferson is the best 4.5 million forward. I also like the Bruno Fernandes pick. He ended last season strongly and got an assist in the Community Shield final against Manchester City, but my biggest gripe with this team is no Liverpool attack whatsoever. No Salah, Jota, Luis Diaz, who is currently linked with Manchester City, by the way, but we can talk about that in future videos and podcasts, and also in Cuckoo and Smith Rowe. Great picks in the long term, but for Game Week 1, it's not ideal with a tough opening fixture. And also Konsa has good fixtures overall, but I think there are better 4.5 million defenders like Robinson, Anderson and Quansah. That's just kind of a personal nitpick there, but overall another very strong squad. It should do well in Game Week 1 and beyond, but there are some issues that will rise to the surface later down the line, like Pedro Porro, for example, and also the lack of Liverpool coverage, I think, is the biggest downfall with this team. Here we have Shivain's team, which was sent in several days ago. He may have made a new draft by now, and the same goes for a few people discussed in today's video and podcast. But Nick Pope is a nice pick in goal. He's an overlooked option, and he could do extremely well for the first 4 game weeks and potentially beyond, actually, as Nick Pope generally does very well FPL-wise. Impressive starting 11, I have to say that, with the exception of Darwin Nunez. If you want 2 Liverpool attackers, then Jota would be my top pick there, and you cover 3 of the best captains in Game Week 1 in Isak, Haaland and Salah. Definitely captain one of those players over Darwin Nunez, who likely won't start in Game Week 1 and for the foreseeable future. Now, some other issues I find with this team is, I think, apart from changing the captain to one of those players, the bench is fairly weak. I'd look to upgrade Luongo and Burgess in particular. Both aren't guaranteed to start in the first place. I think Luongo might be more likely. I'll cover this potentially in an updated lineups video and podcast, but both of them were nailed on last season. They might not be in the upcoming campaign. And an example of making an upgrade would be Darwin to Wood or Joao Pedro, and then using those funds to get Quansah, Mykolenko, Hall and Rodgers. And by the way, you don't get all of those defenders at the same time, but you pick one of those 4.5 million options and you get Rodgers, and you bolster your 50-man squad quite substantially, and that would put you in good stead for the future. Now we're on to Tony Bones 97's team. The Liverpool triple up works very well considering the top of the fixture difficulty rating for the first 8 game weeks of the season. Salah is an excellent captain. The midfield is also very impressive, and Fulkrug has potential at that price point, but there are a few issues with this team, one of which is that the defence could be improved significantly. You've got 2 Nottingham Forest defenders in Bolly and Nico Williams. I already think one is pushing it. To have 2 of them, I think, is way too much, but that's kind of my own personal opinion. The first 3 game weeks look great for Nottingham Forest, and there could be a clean sheet, but I'd highly recommend making quite a lot of changes to your defensive line. I think that way you will have a very competitive squad for game week 1 and also for the medium to long term. I also think Gay isn't guaranteed to start in game week 1. We could see, for example, Chadi Riyad start there instead. He has been signed from Real Betis, and Mark Gay hasn't played many minutes in pre-season. And I also think some of the 4-point family defenders I've mentioned throughout this video would actually cause some massive upgrades to your team. So Mikalenko, Hall, Kwanzaa, even Konso, I'm not a big fan of. I think all of them would be better than Bolly, Nico Williams, and potentially Mark Gay as well. And I'd also look to change Bednarek, Wood, and White, because I think there are so many options in terms of 5 to 5-point family midfielders who will give you that squad depth, and in the defence, even some 4 million defenders like Barco look very appealing. I don't trust Southampton defensively, so Bednarek would definitely not be a recommendation of mine. He will start, to be fair, but I don't think he's a great pick in that defence. You definitely don't want him in your starting 11 week in, week out. But the midfield and forward line is great, don't get me wrong. You've got a very nice setup and potential, but until you fix that defence, I think that is the biggest weakness with your squad. Another long-time viewer of my channel is Wai Tseng. It's a very good defensive line on offer with Pedro Porro, Alexander-Arnold and Lewis Hall. Even your 4th and 5th defenders are quite reasonable in Barco and Robinson. Your attack is also solid, and Isak would be my captaincy choice amongst the players you have as well. Jota is an excellent pick so long as he stays fit. That's always the biggest issue with him. Speaking of issues, I think Robert Sanchez could be a problem for you because Chelsea have 8 goalkeepers in their ranks, and I don't think Robert Sanchez is 100% nailed on to start. I think he will personally in game week 1, as covered in the predicted lineups video and podcast, but it's not an absolute guarantee. And even if he does, it's Man City in game week 1. Great fixtures afterwards, but there are a few concerns about Robert Sanchez and most Chelsea assets, with the exception of Nkuku, Palmer and maybe Jackson once he is fully fit and available, ready to start games week in, week out. And also the Newcastle triple up could be an issue beyond game week 5. I know it still looks very reasonable for the first 4 game weeks, but that could be a problem. And I also think the Spurs assets, Pedro Porro and Son, are almost avoids when they face Newcastle and Arsenal in game weeks 3 and 4. Let's not forget, they have conceded 10 goals in the last 2 visits to St James's Park, and they've lost the last 2 meetings at home to Arsenal. The 11th team is sent in by Wasif, who says the following: KDB is a short-term pick. We'll switch to Foden when he becomes available. United look good, so have Bruno Fernandes. Try my best to balance things out. I desperately want Haaland, but I think this team covers up his points. Gvardiol and KDB will for sure cover the points Haaland will give through assists. This is a very good starting lineup, and the captaincy picks are sound. Plenty of differentials is another big plus point. The same goes for Arsenal, Liverpool, Man City, Man United and Spurs, all being covered offensively. No Chelsea, which could be a bit problematic between game weeks 2 to 8, with Nkuku and Palmer looking so promising, but you can't cover them all, and I do like what you have here in the midfield and forward line, but I will look to improve upon certain areas, and this would mainly be on your bench. I think Greaves and Armada aren't great assets. You could just move to Bergvall or Winks as your 4-point family midfielder, and a Barco at 4 million. I think those would already be big upgrades, but you can also invest a little bit more money in those areas and go to Morgan Rogers or Smith Rowe as your 5th midfielder, and that goes a long way to setting yourself up for the long term. So once Chris Wood has poor fixtures from game week 4 onwards, especially Liverpool away in that particular game week, you can bring in a Smith Rowe, Morgan Rogers or another budget midfielder to start week in, week out, so you're well prepared for that eventuality. De Bruyne has a high ceiling, but his injury record is very concerning to say the least. His minutes are also extensively managed whenever he's available, so switching to Foden when he's available is a good strategy. I think that's definitely the right thing to do there. And Robertson is a risky pick. I would rather go for Van Dijk or Kwanzaa if you can't find a way to stretch to Trent Alexander-Arnold. Now, don't get me wrong, Robertson in the long term should be fairly nailed on, but for game week 1 and possibly game week 2, I think Tsimikas could get the nod, and that's why if you want a 6 million defender, Saliba, Gabriel, maybe Van Dijk or Quansah, as mentioned just now, those options might be more safe in Game Week 1 than Robertson. But apart from that, it's a very strong squad, just a few minor problems here and there, mainly on your bench and with Robertson in your starting 11. Next up is ADNVN, and there's plenty of squad depth on offer, so benching headaches are inevitable. This is either a pro or a con depending on what kind of FPL manager you are, but I have to say, having options on your bench isn't necessarily a bad thing, but there will be bench points from time to time. Haaland scored a hat-trick versus Chelsea in a recent preseason friendly, so captaining him in Game Week 1 versus the same opponent could work very well, and there's good rotation between your 4.5 million goalkeepers on paper. I'm not a big fan of doing that sort of thing. I'd rather have one set and forget option for the rest of the season ideally, but it could work very well in terms of how the fixtures play out between Crystal Palace and Brentford. And Smith Rowe is one of the most enticing budget midfielders in the game, and Solanke has a good chance of starting from the get-go, and I think his appeal only increases following his move to Tottenham Hotspur. But my biggest issue with this squad is no Liverpool attack whatsoever, and Robertson once again isn't an ideal pick. I'd rather go for Van Dijk or Quansah if you want to cover Liverpool defensively, and if you can stretch to Trent Alexander-Arnold, I'd highly recommend it. But Robertson in Game Week 1 is very risky. Unless you have confirmation that he will start, I wouldn't go for him just yet. And Nkunku last on your bench isn't advisable, even with the Man City fixture, which is very tough on paper, but I'd put him ahead of Robinson and Barco, that's for sure. I'd actually probably swap Nkunku and Robinson in your bench order and possibly consider starting Nkunku, but I have to say your starting 11 looks very strong, and I can understand why you haven't gone for that sort of thing. Van de Ven away to Leicester. I'm not a big fan of Van de Ven, to be honest, despite the 4.5 million price tag. The only Spurs defender I'd consider starting in Game Week 1 is Pedro Porro due to the assist threat and bonus points potential. Here we have ChaMQ's team. This is a great front three with Isak, Havertz and Watkins. There's a nice balance to the attack with Salah, Nkunku, Eze and Phil Foden, but I have to say Phil Foden would be my biggest issue there in the attacking areas because he likely won't start in Game Week 1, possibly even Game Week 2 as well. Oscar Bob should start on the right hand side and either Grealish or Doku on the left, but the starting defenders are solid with Trent, Hall and Gvardiol, and Rodgers could provide outstanding value throughout the course of the season, but Johnson and Harwood-Bellis can be upgraded. Barco is a 4 million defender I keep recommending to people, but also 4.5 million choices like Joachim Andersen, Quansah, even a few others like Konsa, for example. I've discussed them throughout this video and podcast. Mikalenko, we are sport for choice at 4.5 million. Even Lisandro Martinez could be a shout this season. And my final point I have to say is Nkunku and Gvardiol causes a clash in your starting 11. I would consider benching one of them or selling Gvardiol, and by downgrading him you can use those funds to upgrade your 4th or 5th defenders at the same time depending on what you want to go for. And my recommendation would be Barco in for Harwood-Bellis and a 4.5 to 5 million defender in for Johnson. Chris Fairhead also sent in several drafts, and this is his final one, or close to it at the very least, and he says, watching pre-season has made me rethink some players and look at some potential cheap midfielders. Carvalho is definitely going to be great and so cheap, and of course for those of you that aren't aware, Fabio Carvalho has moved to Brentford in a permanent move from Liverpool, so he's someone to definitely consider, and Chris Fairhead had him in a very recent draft, but he has gone for the likes of Oscar Bob, who for me has been incredible in pre-season with 2 goals and 4 assists, including a goal contribution in the Community Shield final to set up that Bernardo Silva late equaliser. So he's definitely a very enticing pick for the first 2 game weeks, but maybe not the most long-term safe asset in the Man City ranks. Now there's a great defensive line on offer in the starting 11 with Munoz, Trent Alexander-Arnold and Pedro Porro, and several differentials which creates an interesting attack, mainly with Heung-min Son, who is a differential in the grand scheme of things, and Diogo Jota, who is also the captain. That could work wonders against Ipswich Town upon their Premier League return in Game Week 1. Now you have 3 5 to 5.5 million midfielders, which isn't ideal in terms of flexibility. I know you're kind of keen on these budget midfielders following pre-season, but I'd recommend 1 or 2. I think 3 is probably a bit overkill. I'd rather go for a 6.5 million midfielder just in case. You'd rather have the option to downgrade, and if you wanted to go for these cheaper midfielders eventually, that could be the way to go. I don't think going for Smith Rowe, Rodgers and Oscar Bob at the same time is a viable strategy strategy in terms of flexibility, but maybe I'm being too harsh with that criticism. And my final point is I will look to upgrade your 5th defender, aka Harwood Bellis, and I've said this for the majority of teams covered today. You can easily do that with 0.5 million left in the bank, so I would use those extra funds to upgrade your 5th defender, and I think that could work really well in the long term. Danoslav is one of the few FPL managers covered today who has over 60 expected points according to FPL.team in Game Week 1, and I have to say it looks very promising on paper, looking at the starting 11, which is of high quality. There's a strong defense and there's also good squad depth in every position. But I would place Winks last on your bench. You'll probably do this yourself anyway, but it's always worth mentioning the vice captaincy and the bench order because they can be very important from time to time. And the 2 offensive double-ups you have in Newcastle and Arsenal look very promising, but the Gunners face Aston Villa, Spurs and Man City away in the opening 5 game weeks of the season. So as much as I like Saka and Havertz in isolation, I'd probably recommend moving one of them on and covering a different team entirely, like Manchester City or Chelsea, for example. But it's still a very solid team. Flecken and Henderson could rotate very well together, and starting Flecken might be an underrated shout in their clash in Game Week 1, but I do like what you've gone for with some solid captaincy choices as well. Brian Kelly sent his team in through the Discord server, and it's a very stacked squad, I have to say that. João Pedro is also one of the top budget forwards, despite Brighton's tricky start in terms of fixtures, and Raya is probably the best way of covering the Arsenal defence right now. He's 5.5 million, nailed on. You won't have those issues of will he start or not, like Calafiori, Timber, or Zinchenko at left back. And then you look at White, Saliba and Gabriel. They'll get goal contributions and bonus points for sure, but they also cost quite a lot more than Raya, so the extra 0.5 to 1 million can go a long way to cover the Gunners' defence, and those opening fixtures aren't particularly great. So my biggest issue though with your team, or one of the problems that you could face, is the double up in the Arsenal defence, because Arsenal will keep the most clean sheets this season in my opinion, but for the first 5 game weeks, even the first 11 overall, there are so many tough games on paper, and that's why you may want to tone it down with one attacker in Saka or Havertz and then one defensive coverage in Raya, Saliba, Gabriel or White. Pick one of those 4, but going for both is probably not ideal if you're a fixtures person. Now, if you still think Arsenal will keep clean sheets, then fair enough. You might be onto something and I'm going to be completely wrong. But if you look at it from a fixtures perspective, it is very concerning. Foden is an avoid for now. I think he'll become a great option, but for the time being, I don't think he'll start until Game Week 2 or 3. And I would go for a different 4 million goalkeeper with lower ownership than Turner. This could be Fabianski or maybe someone else entirely like Bentley, who is probably the least likely to go down in price after the first few game weeks of the season. All of these teams are very impressive, and John G's is no exception. While I prefer doubling up on Liverpool's attack, I think going for Alisson and Van Dijk could work very well. If you want a cheaper alternative, then consider Quansah at 4.5 million. He's not as nailed on as Van Dijk. He won't score as many goals, but he could get plenty of starts this season. He's got so much potential at centre-back, and I think he'll be the main centre-back partnership for Virgil van Dijk instead of Konate this season. Your squad depth gives you flexibility, which is a big plus point, and the team is well balanced. But I have to say, Mykolenko, Gvardiol, Rodgers and Nkunku, all good picks overall. But for Game Week 1, their fixtures aren't ideal, so you might want to switch one or two of them if you want to go off to a very strong start. No Liverpool attack though is the biggest problem with this squad. It doesn't mean you'll do poorly, you can still be very competitive, but I'd definitely recommend one Liverpool attacker if you can help it. Maddison could be benched with Kulusevski impressing in central areas throughout pre-season. And if Solanke starts from Game Week 1, which is a possibility, we could see Brennan Johnson on the right, Kulusevski as the attacking midfielder, Son on the left, and Solanke up front. So Maddison isn't the most nailed-on player overall. I definitely recommend switching him to another 7.5 million midfielder or below, and you've got so many options as discussed throughout all of my videos and podcasts throughout the summer. And finally, Cannon to Jefferson, João Pedro or Armstrong could work very well in your setup, and you can find those funds by downgrading one of Virgil van Dijk or Gvardiol. Here we have MikkDC's team, and he says, still debating whether to start Ramsey over Soucek. So let's start off with the positives. Salah's a great captain with a fantastic Game Week 1 track record. Your front three is excellent. Solanke, Isak and Watkins can compete with those with Erling Haaland, for example, and Kai Havertz, and you have good picks in isolation, particularly in your starting 11. But as good as Arsenal's defence is, going for a triple up defensively is just not viable with their opening fixtures. I think a double up is considerable, even facing Aston Villa, Spurs, Man City in the opening 5, Brighton at home, and you've got other tough fixtures on the horizon. But I think going for a triple up is way too much, and Calafiori isn't guaranteed to start in Game Week 1. I think it'll be Zinchenko, who's done very well in the last 2 preseason games. He's played a lot over the summer, and Calafiori's only played a handful of minutes in that 2-0 win over Lyon as a substitute. So I wouldn't recommend going for Calafiori right now. Raya and White are great picks in isolation. You could go for both of them if you're that bullish on the Arsenal defence, but don't go for a triple up defensively. I think that would probably be way too much, especially when Calafiori isn't nailed on right now. The Newcastle offensive triple up also cause an imbalance in your squad, and Crystal Palace defensive double up as well as the Aston Villa attacking duo is way too much. You've got too many double ups and triple ups in my opinion. Maybe I'm wrong and they could work very well, and of course you'll be laughing at the end, but I just think all these doubles and triple ups are probably not the best in terms of balance, variety and flexibility in your 50-man squad. I would suggest moving Bruno Guimaraes, Ramsey, Soucek and Mark Gay to players like Nkuku, Smith Rowe, Rodgers and Mykolenko, to name some examples. And even though it's a nitpick, I'd definitely change your vice captain to someone like Isak or even Solanke. I wouldn't vice captain a goalkeeper. I've seen a few people do that in this video and podcast, and also whenever people send in their teams, it's very important to vice captain someone you really trust, because if your original captain doesn't feature whatsoever, your vice captain will then have their points doubled instead, and that can be very beneficial to your game week score. But it's still a very strong team. It might seem like I'm going in on it. That's definitely not the case. You've made some very good picks, but I personally am not a big fan of having 3 or 4 double/triple ups, and with Arsenal's opening fixtures, I just can't justify going for Raya, White and Calafiori simultaneously. Another team sent in through Instagram is by Proto. I think that's how you say it. Apologies if I get any of these names wrong, but it's an impressive starting 11. The 7 main attackers are definitely good choices, and the defensive line looks promising beyond Game Week 1, but a few issues I have with this is the bench, which is fairly weak. Jefferson as your 4-point family and forward could be enough to improve it substantially. So move your 4-point family and forward from Wolves to Jefferson, and that already improves your 50-man squad quite a lot. And also Wout Fast to a 4-point family and defender would help bolster your squad and give you options from every single week, and this helps you to navigate the fixtures in a better way. Downgrading Gvardiol might be necessary if you can't find a way to upgrade Wout Fast to a 4.5 or over defender, so that could be an issue or something you're not very keen on doing. But I have to say, downgrading Gvardiol is not the worst thing to do. I like his fixtures between Game Weeks 2 to 4, but I don't think Man City look that solid at the moment, and missing Rodri could be a massive blow to them, and I wouldn't be surprised if they struggle to keep clean sheets in the opening Game Weeks of this season. Team number 20 is sent in by Real Madrid Are Cooking through the Discord server, another long-time viewer of this channel. The triple captain can work very well in Game Week 1, especially with an asset like Mohamed Salah. Given his track record, he has produced, I think, 6 double-digit returns in the opening game weeks of the season. You have strong squad depth, no Haaland or Watkins, but the front line remains competitive with Solanke, Isak, and even Jefferson as your 4-point family and forward. He could be decent. And although I'm not a fan of rotating goalkeepers, Flecken and Sanchez could work very well, but the triple up in Spurs is problematic in game weeks such as 3 and 4, facing Newcastle and Arsenal. With their recent records in mind, as I discussed earlier, I wouldn't go for a triple up in Spurs. I think 1 or 2 is probably the sweet spot. I like the opening 2 fixtures, but I wouldn't go for a triple up right now unless you're looking to wildcard fairly early on this season. And in my opinion, there is a lack of flexibility with Oscar Bob and Jefferson, the way you've structured your team. And look, I like those picks in isolation. I like Oscar Bob for the first 2 game weeks anyway, until Phil Foden returns and makes that right wing spot his own. And Bob can still get a lot of game time this season, but it's not an absolute guarantee he'll get those minutes that you want. So you can start Oscar Bob week in, week out. And you may want to do that because your bench players, for example, include the likes of Mykolenko, Anderson, Robertson, who are all very good, but then Jefferson, who might start some games and then be benched in others. So just bear that in mind. The lack of flexibility could be an issue, But overall, look at the expected points for this team, 66.2, and I think the triple up in Spurs does contribute greatly towards that, but just bear in mind there are a few issues that will rise to the surface in Game Weeks 3 and 4. We have Shockersfc's team here on screen, and Dean Henderson is a decent 4.5 million goalkeeper. He's not my favourite pick in this position, but at that price point, I could see him doing well this season, especially given Crystal Palace's opening fixtures. There are good picks across all positions, and I like the fact you've covered Arsenal, Liverpool and Man City offensively. I think you've done it very well, and it's a big plus point of this team. But my gripes with this squad would be your vice-captain, which is obviously a very small nitpick, but it's definitely worth mentioning and highlighting. I'd say Salah, Isak or Havertz are much better options for the captaincy than Dean Henderson. Erling Haaland will play regardless, so it's not going to be a big factor, but just in case, you sometimes get these weird scenarios where your main captain doesn't play and you want to be ready just in case. And my other point would be your bench. Rodgers and Gvardiol should be ahead of Harwood-Bellis in my opinion, and make it a habit to order your bench in such a way so you have your weakest player third on your bench, and in my opinion that would be Harwood-Bellis, who could be improved upon, to be fair. I don't like the fact you've got two 4 million defenders, but then again I can see the appeal and why so many people are doing it, but I would definitely recommend going for 4.5 million defenders over Harwood-Bellis and the vast majority of those 4 million defenders on offer. Number 22 is Tomartski, who has a Chelsea midfield double up with Nkuku and Palmer. I like both picks in isolation. I think they can do very well with their favourable fixtures between Game Weeks 2 and 8, but the opening game against Man City isn't ideal, especially when you have Gvardiol in your starting 11 at the same time. But speaking of which, your starting 11 is still competitive and your defensive line is sound in most game weeks until Barco loses a spot and drops down to the bench. And apart from Haaland, you have the two best forwards in the game. But my biggest issue with this team is no Liverpool or Man City attackers whatsoever, which could be very difficult to navigate. And you also have Fass and a 4.5 million forward. I think both can be upgraded upon with the players I've discussed today, with a lot of these scenarios which are identical in certain cases. I'd probably downgrade either Gvardiol or Son to make that happen. The 23rd and final team is sent in by vroomvroomcalloom, what a name by the way, and he says the following: debating whether to downgrade Davis and upgrade Pickford to Raya is worth it, and if Bailey is worth the 1.5 million over Rodgers. Apart from that, the plan is to get Foden over Saka in Game Week 2, hence why there is no City attack. So my favourite things about this squad is the fact that your squad contains 8 potent attackers with multiple teams covered, and this can compete with Watkins or Haaland in certain game weeks. And the Saka to Foden move looks good on paper when you look at the fixtures, so that isn't really a bad thing necessarily, but Saka is fixture proof and it could still backfire either way, and Phil Foden hasn't played whatsoever in pre-season, so it might take him quite a while to get things going, and it's difficult to judge whether Bailey is worth 1.5 million more than Rodgers. If you look at last season, you'd probably say yes, but I think Rodgers looked very impressive in the recent friendlies and he has a big part to play in Aston Villa this season. I think Pickford is more appealing than Raya to start this campaign because of Everton's fixtures until December in Game Week 14, whilst Arsenal have a pretty rough ride until Game Week 12 when things start to look better for the Gunners. I'd sell Davis for another 4.5 million defender instead of downgrading him to a 4 million option, but that's just me. Your squad depth would still be strong if you went for Wout Fass, maybe Vestergaard, or any 4 million starting defender like Harwood-Bellis. You can see the full list in my predicted lineups video and podcast where I cover all 20 Premier League clubs and what we could see in Game Week 1. But it's a strong squad. There's a few issues here and there, and I think once again it comes down to a few simple issues with squad depth and choosing the right 4th or 5th defenders. Davis got 18 assists in the Championship last season, but with the opening 2 fixtures against Liverpool and Manchester City, I would avoid all Ipswich Town assets until Game Week 3. And there we have it. I've rated 23 of your FPL teams. I try to include as many as possible in this video and podcast. It has been a blast talking about them, also making notes on every single one of them, and there are obviously a few things I may not have spotted, and if you want to give more constructive criticism, be sure to do so in the comments section. It'd be greatly appreciated in terms of how I rated them, but also in terms of those specific teams and certain moves they could consider in Game Weeks 2, 3 and beyond, or maybe just a Game Week 1 transfer that can make all the difference so they get off to a flying start in Fantasy Premier League. On screen you can see Draft Town. It's a great resource and the player rankings is my personal favourite, but they've also got predicted lineups, and if you want to see an updated lineups video and podcast, be sure to let me know down in the comment section below. And thank you very much for watching this video and listening to this podcast. If you enjoyed it or found it useful, then be sure to smash the like button and subscribe for new. Let's try to get this video to 200 likes and let's keep on pushing towards 35 subscribers and beyond. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram, DylanRCM, and check all the other links in the description below for my Patreon and the championships, the Discord server, FPL League, Draft Town, as well as Spotify. Leave a 5-star review on my podcast. It goes a long way to supporting my channel. I wish you all the best of luck for Game Week 1. Keep your eyes peeled for the team selection and the deadline stream this week, and I'll see you very soon.